It's that one Dark Tower book. You know, the Dark Tower book that's not actually a Dark Tower book. That one. So this is literally the first book that I ever bought, like, on the day that it came out. You know you're a book nerd when you're there, like, it's like a movie and it's like opening day and you're like standing in line to get the book. I didn't have to stand in line. There are no lines at bookstores. But yeah, no, I literally went the day this came out. I was super excited. I had already read the Tower series and I heard that he was coming out with a new one and it was going to slot right in between books 4 and 5. And I was all about it. And I got it and I read it and I loved every second. I mean, I adored this, but I still adore this book. This book is wonderful. But King is just absolutely amazing at coming up with ideas and then executing those ideas. Not all of his ideas are wonderful. He has some stinkers. He's had some bombs. I gave him a bad review last year, one of his books. But as far as just churning out an idea and then executing on that, it's just mind-blowing how good he is at that. And then when he does have a genuinely good idea and he just does his standard, I can execute better than you, for the most part. But anyway, when King is able to come up with a genuinely good idea and then you pair that with his excellence in execution, you end up with The Wind Through the Keyhole or any other good King book, realistically. But this is right up there. This is one of them. So it picks up literally immediately where the last Wizard and Glass left off. And there's like a little 30-page, I don't know how many, section of this book that fills in the gaps between books 4 and 5 of the Dark Tower. Because book 4 ends and they're here, and when book 5 starts up, they're just kind of on the edge of the colossus. And it's just kind of like this little blip that doesn't really explain how they got from point A to point B. So he wrote a 300-page book to explain that little blip, but it's like 99% something very different. But anyway, so they're traveling to the colossus, and there is a storm approaching, and they're going to have to hunker down and hide from this storm. By the way, storm's super cool. It's called a Stark Blast, and it's this cold weather front that comes through so rapidly that trees literally snap and explode because the temperature changes so quickly. And it's just like, you can hear it coming as it happens. It's just like, doosh, doosh, doosh. Just the atmosphere that he creates in describing the way this storm approaches is just wonderful. He's so good. And the dread, the sense of urgency that they're going to have to get somewhere, they're going to have to get inside, they're going to have to get inside fast. The trees aren't safe. You definitely aren't. But anyway, so they get inside and they get to safety and they're going to hunker down and they're going to wait for this storm to pass. So guess what we're going to do to pass the time? Roland's going to tell a story. And it's wonderful. This book is the Russian nesting doll equivalent of a Stephen King book, because he's going to tell a story, Roland, and then inside that story, it's going to be a story about his childhood where he then has to tell another story. So it's like a story within a story within a story. But firstly, the story that he's going to tell to Eddie and Susanna and Jake is a story about when he, as soon as he got back from his mission in Magus, he then gets sent out to go deal with this skin man or a shapeshifter. His dad doesn't believe that it's real, but somebody has to go deal with it. The adults are too busy dealing with the good man, John Farson, so we're going to send a kid again, just like the last time, because they don't deem this really important enough of a job for the adults to do. And then, while we're down there, he concocts a plan, which it involves him having to hunker down in a cell overnight with a little boy. So to keep this little boy entertaining company, keep him from being too nervous about what they're doing, because they are doing a relatively dangerous job for at least the boy to be doing. So he's going to keep him busy by telling him a story. So this is that Russian nesting doll. And the story he chooses to tell to the boy is a fairy tale. And then the book ends up being mostly the fairy tale. So you get Roland in the present day, Roland as a child, and a fairy tale. And the two Roland-centric stories are actually the smallest part of the book. And that's fine, because the fairy tale is just so wonderful that you don't care. Also, this takes place later in King's career when, wherever this argument falls with people of, King's old books are the only good books that King wrote. First off, that's incorrect. And secondly, this takes place later in his career when he has gotten to the point where he can pare down a book to 300 pages, tell 3 stories. One of them's really not much of a story, so it's more like 2 stories in one. But either way, he can tell multiple complete stories, and he's gotten so good at what he does, and he is so fast and so succinct. All of the characters end up feeling completely realistic, thought through, thought out. You get everything that he needs you to get in the smallest page count, word count humanly possible. The character development that he would have spent hundreds of pages on when he in his younger days, and there's nothing wrong with those books. They're just as good. Oh my God. He can do so much quicker now because he's just kind of fine-tuned the art of his character development. It's so razor sharp. It's really, really impressive to read some of his later works when he tries to do that character work. It's so sharp. It's amazing. Then, because most of this book is the fairy tale part of the book, it ends up being by far the most fantasy book of all the Dark Tower books. It's just fun and refreshing to just kind of read through because it's not even really reality. It's legitimately a fairy tale, although it's kind of like, well, is this actually something that happened, or is this just a fairy tale that people tell? I like to think that this is probably something that actually happened, but either way, it's still presented as a fairy tale, and it's great for it. You get wizards and swamp people and dragons and fairies, and I think out of all of those elements, I think my favorite was the fairy, just for the sheer simple fact that it's not a pretty fairy. It is a pretty fairy, but the fairy is beautiful. But it feels more like like the fairies I would have grown up with way back in like the 80s and stuff. There's something dark and creepy and twisted. They don't feel, even though it's presented as this cute, happy, pretty fairy, something about its behavior, and it just seems a little off, and it seems a little too mischievous. You're kind of creeped out by the fairy almost. Like, I don't think I like this fairy. I think this fairy's up to no good. I think she's fucking with them right now. When the fairy's around, you're like, I don't think I like the fairy. And that was my favorite. Anyway, I just can't compliment this book enough. It was so good. And it was just as good the second time around as it was the first time. I adore it. Now, all that being said, I was actually pretty eager to get to this book in particular in the series because the last time I read it out of order because I had completed the whole series when this book came out, and I read it after the fact. And it was so good, and I loved every second of it. And I was kind of curious because it is slotted, the beginning and the end of it kind of bookends into, and it slots right in between books 4 and 5, kind of marries the two together. I was curious to see how it would flow if you slot it in where it goes. How does that affect the flow of the 8-book run, 7-book run originally, 8-book run if you include this one? And unfortunately, I don't think it fits very well. I wanted it to. I really did. I'm going to be like, oh, that just made everything even better. And I don't think it did. As much as I love this book, the flow seriously comes to a halt right when it feels like the story should be picking up to move. And before, that's what it did. It just picks up and it moves. And here, like, you just got done with a hard stop to learn Roland's backstory. And then the story picks up and it feels like it's time to move forward, and you get like literally no forward motion before it stops again for this book. And the book 4 stop feels earned and appropriate because that's what you've been, it's placed properly, it's where it should be, it feels right to stop there. To immediately stop again for this, unfortunately, doesn't feel right. It doesn't feel like an appropriate stopping point. So as far as recommending this book, I can't recommend this book enough to anyone, period, honestly, but especially if you've read The Dark Tower or are reading The Dark Tower. I cannot recommend this book enough. This is such a good book. It's kind of crazy. But the problem is it's difficult to recommend where to read it. No matter where you read it, it's going to feel a little bit out of place. I originally read it at the end, and it felt a little bit out of place because of the way it's structured, like it's meant to go in between books 4 and 5. And then if you read it in between books 4 and 5, then it feels a little bit out of place because it doesn't feel like that's an appropriate stopping point to tell this story. So it's hard to recommend where and when and how to read it. But you know what? Just fucking read it because it's really good and it's really worth a read. And I'm going to go so far as to give this one a solid 9. I really think it was that good of a book. I really like it. I really, really, really like it. Thank you for watching, everybody, and I will see you next time.